intellectuals, politicians, moralists of all sorts, who are very much attached to the project of forwarding capitalist society and forwarding even neoliberalism. These assorted people are increasingly worried themselves because they increasingly see that a kind of economy that literally puts everything up for sale, right? A kind of economy like that ultimately can actually destroy itself, right? Can destroy itself. And there were intimations of the self-destruction, for example, when we had that in the United States, certainly, the dot-com crash and the recognition that much of the accounting procedures of the previous 10 years had been fiction, right? Had been largely produced by corporate leaders that, in effect, had robbed their own shareholders to forward their own ends. So this was an example of the fact that once you put as primary the vision of a society where everything is up for grabs, well then it's a society that can very well lead to its own self-destruction, because in the end a capitalist society requires trust, at least among the capitalists. Okay? So this concern that in fact neoliberalism was going too far was widely expressed by different figures, intellectual and political figures, throughout the 1990s and into the 21st century. And as a consequence, what begins to happen is a big discussion within their ranks about the issues of cooperation, the importance of cooperation, the importance of trust, the importance of basically reciprocity, all those nice and fuzzy things, the importance of community. Suddenly, we don't hear about the capitalist class, it's always now the business community, right? We're all now, right? I mean, in fact, you can find, it would be good to index this development by seeing how often the word business community pops up. And you see, undoubtedly, as we go through the 1990s, it becomes more and more the way in which basically capitalists refer to themselves. They want to be in a community too. We want to be in a community. They want to be in a community too. Okay. Now, I would say this general discussion becomes very important for the concept of the commons, because increasingly in the 1990s, something important happens with the concept of the commons in the writings and thinkings of, in thought of World Bank officials and their allies in the scholarly world. Okay? What begins to happen is that after a decade, in the 1980s, when the World Bank had been, by the way, can you hear me now? Can I lean back? In the 1980s, the World Bank was committed to full-scale neoliberal policies that would privatize basically the government provision of services from education to healthcare, and privatize communal land regimes in Africa and in other parts of the third world where loans were being given. Okay, now this policy met tremendous resistance. Sometimes directly, in terms of armed resistance, and if you look at many of the struggles that were going on in the 1980s, sometimes they're talked about as if they were drug wars, for example, or tribal wars. Drug wars in South America and tribal wars in Africa, but actually often when you study where they came from, you would see that in fact these were struggles against appropriation of land by large corporations that had been in effect held by structural adjustment programs. So that's one thing. So there was a big struggle in the 1980s against the attack on communal land throughout, certainly South America and in Africa. But also, there was in the context of this struggle, the recognition by the World Bank that it is possible to carry on profitable agricultural work using common property relations. And this insight, this tremendous insight, that basically the commons could be compatible with capitalism, was something that gets first announced more or less in 1992 in one of these annual World Bank reports, and afterwards becomes a very an integral part of World Bank discussion and planning. And so in 1995, for example, the World Bank sets up a study group to study common property regimes. And since then, there are literally hundreds of studies, either done by or sponsored by the World Bank, to study common property and how common property could be used to be an integral part of capitalist development in different parts of the world. And so, along with that notion, the World Bank develops this idea that, in fact, there is something called the global commons, all right? That is, the atmosphere, the seas, for example. As far as we're concerned, no one owns it, or everybody owns it, right? Whereas the World Bank then begins to say that, in fact, these are commons that should be managed by someone, okay? And since the World Bank and the IMF are part of a basically United Nations system, people forget that, by the way. These are UN bodies, World Bank and the IMF. Since they're part of the, in effect, as far as they're concerned, the world government or the governmental entity that is responsible for the world, well, therefore, they, the World Bank and the IMF, are the likely candidates to be good stewards of this global commons, to organize how this global commons should be used and developed for the good, presumably, of humanity. Okay, so the notion of the commons then becomes, into the 1990s, a very important part of the way in which these agencies begin to understand themselves and understand how they're going to proceed to carry on this project of bringing the world into a situation where, in effect, neoliberalism will be triumphant, okay? That is, through the use, in this case, of the commons itself. Oh, I mean, I'm not talking about non-Euclidean geometry. I'm talking about the fact that what begins to happen is that the World Bank, IMF thinkers are beginning to see that it's going to be important that the commons become part of their way of thinking about and doing their practice.